The little girl had been in the water for 40 seconds when Marcus pulled her out. He didn't think about it. He didn't calculate the temperature or the current or the drop from the embankment or what it would cost his body, which had already paid a price most people would not believe if he described it. He went in. He got her. He brought her to the bank and set her down on the grass and made sure she was breathing, and then he stepped back. Because stepping back was what he did and had done for 3 years now. Back from the light, back from the center, back into the periphery, where a man sleeping under the Callaway Bridge in a canvas sleeping bag did not have to explain himself to anyone. The little girl was breathing. The little girl was safe. The man who had saved her was already walking away before the first person on the jogging path reached her side. He had not given his name. He had not waited for thanks. He had not done the thing that would have led, 9 months later, to the CEO of one of the most valuable technology companies in the world, standing in front of 2,000 employees with his voice breaking, holding a photograph, saying he had spent 8 months trying to find a man who did not want to be found, and that what he discovered when he finally did find him was something he needed every person in that room to understand. 6 years before the morning at the river, Marcus Dillard had a life that was structured and purposeful, and that he had built with both hands over 22 years. He had enlisted at 19, the son of a postal worker and a school librarian from Akron, Ohio. A young man who was not running from anything when he signed the papers, but moving towards something, a shape for himself that the civilian world had not yet offered him. He found that shape in the Army with the particular satisfaction of someone whose specific qualities, steadiness under pressure, spatial awareness, the ability to remain functional when every surrounding signal says the situation is beyond managing, happen to align perfectly with what a military environment requires and rewards. He rose to staff sergeant. He served 3 deployments, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He received a commendation he didn't talk about for an action in Fallujah in 2007 that his commanding officer described in the citation as demonstrating extraordinary presence of mind under direct fire. He came home each time to his wife, Denise, and eventually to their son, Elijah, who was 4 years old when Marcus finished his final deployment and separated from the Army at 41 with the intention of building whatever came next. What came next did not arrive cleanly. It rarely did, for men like Marcus, though nobody said that plainly enough or early enough for it to be useful. The transition out was disorienting in ways he could not organize into a sentence that made sense to the people around him. He was not in danger. He was not in combat. He was in a suburb of Columbus, in a house with a son who needed him present in ways that required a different kind of presence than anything his training had asked of him. The steadiness that had been a professional asset became a kind of distance. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive became a system with no off switch. He slept badly. He startled at sounds. He sat sometimes in the parking lots of grocery stores for 20 minutes before he could make himself go inside. He did not call what was happening to him by its name for 2 years, because naming it meant accepting it, and accepting it meant accounting for the gap between who he had been and who he was currently capable of being, and that gap was not one he was ready to measure. Denise named it first, gently and then with increasing urgency, and the urgency was not impatience, it was fear. The specific fear of a woman watching someone she loved disappear by increments. He heard her. He did not, for longer than he should have, act on what he heard. The marriage ended in the 3rd year. Not in anger. That would have been easier. In some ways, because anger has edges you can locate. It ended in the exhausted way that things end when 2 people have both tried sincerely, and the trying has cost them more than they had available to spend. Elijah was 7. Marcus moved into an apartment. He found work at a logistics company. He lost the job after 8 months during a downsizing that was not about him, and that he nonetheless experienced as confirmation of something he'd been quietly believing about himself. He found other work. He lost it. He found a room. He lost it. The steps down were smaller than people imagined from the outside, and faster, and each one made the next one slightly easier to accept, because the threshold of what constituted tolerable had been quietly moving. He had been sleeping under the Callaway Bridge for 14 months when he went into the river after the girl. The river path on the east side of the city was a 3-mile loop popular with a particular demographic of people whose morning schedules were flexible enough to accommodate a 6 a.m. run: tech workers, young professionals, the employees of the half-dozen startup campuses that had colonized the old warehouse district 2 blocks north. Marcus knew the path the way he knew most of the geography within a mile of the bridge, thoroughly, practically, with the eye of someone who depended on his environment for safety rather than recreation. He knew where the embankment was highest. He knew where the current ran fast after rain. He knew that the decorative wooden fence along the eastern curve was rotting at the base, which was information a jogger would not need, and which he had filed automatically, the way he filed everything. He was sitting on the far bank at 6:14 in the morning, on the flat concrete ledge where the drainage culvert met the river wall, eating the second half of a breakfast sandwich he'd gotten from the shelter on Morrison Street. He was not watching the path. He was watching the water, which he sometimes did in the early morning because the water did not require anything of him. He heard the fence before he saw it, the specific crack of compromised wood giving way under sudden weight, and then he saw the girl. 7 years old, maybe 8. Pink jacket. She had been leaning against the fence to look at the water the way children lean against things without understanding what holds them, and the fence had made its decision. And now, she was in the river. Marcus was already moving before she hit the water. He did not think about the temperature or the current or the 3-year inventory of things his body had lost. He went in from the ledge, 15 feet, angled to intercept the current's pull. He reached her in 11 seconds. He had her out in 40. He set her on the bank. He checked her airway, her breathing, her color. He tilted her forward, cleared her throat, spoke to her in the calm, direct voice of someone who has managed people in crisis and knows that tone is the first thing a frightened person responds to. She coughed. She breathed. She looked at him with the enormous eyes of a child who has just understood that something very serious has happened and that she is, inexplicably, okay. He heard the first jogger shouting from the path above. He heard the sound of feet changing direction, the commotion of attention converging. He looked at the girl once more, breathing, conscious, starting to cry in the way children do when the shock releases and safety allows the fear out. And then he stood up and walked along the riverbank in the direction away from the path, moving at the steady, unhurried pace of someone with somewhere to be, until he reached the underpass and the familiar dark, and the canvas sleeping bag and the sounds of the city filtering in from above. He ate the rest of the breakfast sandwich. He did not think about what he'd done in the way that produces story or narrative or the expectation of response. He thought about it the way he thought about most things he did that were simply correct. Briefly, practically, then not at all. What Marcus did not know was the girl's name. What he could not have known was that her name was Sophie Garrett, that she was 7 years old, and that her father was Daniel Garrett, who was the founder and chief executive officer of Viridian Systems, a cloud infrastructure company currently valued at $31 billion, whose face appeared on the covers of 3 business publications in the past year alone, and whose personal security team had, by 9 that morning, reviewed every piece of available footage from the river path's 2 functioning cameras and identified a partial image of the man who had pulled his daughter from the water. The image was partial because Marcus had moved along the bank in the direction away from the cameras, which was not a decision made to avoid identification, but simply the direction of the underpass. The image showed a man in his mid-40s, black, heavy-set in the way that suggests former physical conditioning rather than its absence, wearing a canvas jacket and carrying nothing. The image was not sufficient to identify him. It was sufficient to confirm that he had been the one who went into the water. Daniel Garrett was not a man who used the word impossible casually. He ran a company that solved problems other companies had declared unsolvable, and he had a reflexive distrust of the word as a category. He told his security team to find the man. He told them to use whatever resources were required. He told his assistant to coordinate with the city, with the shelter system, with anyone who might have relevant information. He was not strategic about it in the early weeks. He was a father. His daughter was alive. He needed to find the person responsible for that. The search took 8 months. It was not 8 months of continuous failure. It was 8 months of the specific difficulty of finding someone who is not registered anywhere, who has no fixed address, who moves between shelters and encampments and river paths according to a logic that is entirely practical and entirely invisible to the systems that track people who want to be tracked. Marcus did not know he was being searched for. He had no phone. He had no online presence. He had, in 3 years of living as he lived, become as legible to the city's official infrastructure as a man could become, while still existing within it. A caseworker named Roy, who worked for the Veterans Services Organization that operated the Morrison Street shelter, and who had known Marcus by his first name for 2 years, was the one who made the connection. He'd seen the partial image in a local news story about the river rescue 7 months prior. He hadn't been certain. It was the jacket that settled it. A specific canvas jacket Marcus had received from a donation bin 8 months ago that had a small tear at the left shoulder Roy had noticed because he noticed details about the people he served. Because details were what separated knowing someone from knowing about them. He mentioned it to his supervisor. His supervisor, after some internal deliberation about privacy and consent and the specific ethics of a situation that had no clean precedent, reached out to Daniel Garrett's team. Roy went to Marcus first. He found him on the concrete ledge by the drainage culvert, the same ledge which Marcus returned to on clear mornings because the water was still easier than most things. Roy sat down beside him. He told him that a family was looking for him. He told him why. He told him he wanted to let Marcus decide what happened next, because that was what Roy believed in, that the people he served had the right to make their own decisions about their own lives, even when those decisions looked, from the outside, like they were against their own interests. Marcus listened. He looked at the water for a while. Then he said, "She's okay?" Roy said she was fine. She was back in school. Her father had been searching for 8 months. Marcus nodded. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he didn't want anything from the man, that he hadn't done it for anything, that he wanted Roy to tell them she was okay and leave it at that. Roy said he understood. He also said that Daniel Garrett had indicated he wasn't looking to give Marcus anything. He was looking to say thank you in person. That there was a difference. And that in Roy's experience, allowing people to say thank you was sometimes its own form of generosity, and that Marcus had been generous in many directions for a long time, and perhaps this one was available to him too. Marcus looked at the water for another long time. Then he said, "Set it up." The meeting did not happen in a boardroom. Daniel Garrett had offered that, had offered through Roy any setting Marcus wanted, any terms, anything that would make the conversation possible. Marcus had said a coffee shop was fine. The one on Morrison Street, the one he sometimes sat outside when the weather was good, and the owner, a Salvadoran woman named Carmen, left the outdoor chairs unlocked. Daniel Garrett arrived first, which surprised Marcus when Roy told him later that Garrett had insisted on it, had said it was important to him to be the one waiting. He was 44 years old and looked, in person, somewhat younger than the magazine covers suggested. Because the magazine covers had been taken in the specific composed context of professional portraiture, and what Marcus saw when he sat down across from him was a man who had not been sleeping well for 8 months, and who was not trying to hide it. He did not lead with the company or the money or the professional biography, none of which he offered and Marcus hadn't asked for. He led with Sophie. He described the morning at the river the way parents describe things that almost happened, in pieces with gaps where the full picture was still too close to look at directly. He said she talked about the man in the river sometimes, that she said he had a calm voice, that she said he held her like he knew what he was doing. Marcus listened without moving. Garrett said he'd spent 8 months and considerable resources trying to find him, and that when Roy had called, he'd been in a meeting with 40 people and had left the meeting without explanation and driven to Morrison Street himself. He said he was not there to change Marcus's circumstances without his consent or to make assumptions about what Marcus needed. He was there because his daughter was alive, and he needed the man responsible for that to know what that meant. He stopped talking. His hands were flat on the table, and his jaw was tight in the way of a man holding himself to steadiness. And Marcus recognized that expression because he had worn it many times in his own life, from the inside. Marcus said, "How old is she?" Garrett said, 7. 8 in March. Marcus nodded. He thought about Elijah, who was now 13 and lived with Denise in Columbus, and who Marcus had not seen in 14 months. Not because the relationship was broken, but because Marcus had been, until recently, unable to present himself to his son in a way that felt like presenting anything worth arriving with. He said, "I have a son." It was the first personal thing he had said in the conversation. Garrett waited. Marcus said his son was 13, and that he'd been away from him longer than he should have been, and that he was working on that, and that it was slow. He said he hadn't done anything at the river because the girl was a CEO's daughter. He said he would have gone in for anyone. Garrett said he knew that. He said that was the part of it that he needed the people who worked for him to understand. Marcus looked at him. He said, "What people?" Garrett said he ran a company. He said there were 2,000 people who worked for him, and that over 8 months of searching he had become increasingly aware that the story of the man at the river was a story about something he had been trying, and failing, to build into the culture of his company. The willingness to act without an audience, without credit, without the machinery of recognition attached. He said he'd been using frameworks and consultants and offsites, and that all of it produced the right language and almost none of the right behavior. He said he thought the problem was that the people he was trying to reach had never seen the thing itself, and that if Marcus was willing, he wanted to tell the story. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Carmen came out and refilled the coffee without being asked, the way she did for the people she recognized. He said, "What would you say?" Garrett said he would say exactly what had happened, and exactly who Marcus was, not as a condition on his identity, but as context. He said he would not ask Marcus to be present if Marcus didn't want to be present. He said whatever Marcus wanted, in terms of what was said and what was not said, he would honor. He said he was not offering money in exchange for the story, but that he was aware Marcus had a son he was trying to get back to, and that if there was anything practical that would make that journey shorter, he would like to be useful in whatever way Marcus would allow. Marcus looked at the river. You couldn't see it from Carmen's coffee shop, but he had spent enough time near it to feel the direction of it. He said, "Tell the truth. Don't make me into something I'm not." Garrett said, "That's all I'm planning to do." The all-hands meeting at Veridian Systems was not on the official company calendar until 4 days before it happened. The 2,000 employees gathered in the main atrium of the campus knew only that the meeting was mandatory, and that it was not about earnings or product or the quarterly numbers that usually occasioned a full company gathering. They came in curious and somewhat guarded, the way employees are when the format is unfamiliar. Garrett stood at the front, without slides. He was not a man who spoke to his company without slides. That detail alone shifted the room's attention before he said a word. He told them about Sophie. He told them about the morning at the river. He described the partial image on the camera, the 8 months of searching, the caseworker named Roy who had sat on a concrete ledge and told a man the truth about what was being asked, and let him decide. He held up a photograph, Marcus at the coffee shop, taken with his permission, not posed. Marcus looking off to the side with his hands around a coffee cup and the particular stillness that was his most consistent quality. He said this man was a veteran. He said this man had served 3 deployments and come home to a transition that the country had not adequately prepared for or supported. He said this man was sleeping under a bridge on the morning he went into a cold river to save a child he'd never seen before, and walked away without telling anyone his name. He said he was telling the story not to perform gratitude, though the gratitude was real and would remain real for the rest of his life. He was telling it because he had spent 2 years paying consultants to teach his company what this man had demonstrated for free on a Tuesday morning: that integrity is not the thing you perform when people are watching. It is the thing you do when no one is watching, and nothing will come of it except that the thing was done. The atrium was quiet in the way large spaces are quiet when the people in them have stopped checking their phones. Garrett said Marcus had agreed to one thing, which was to let the story be told. He said everything else that happened from this point was Marcus's to determine. He said he would not be telling them what that looked like, because it was not his to tell. He said, "Take care of the people who take care of others. Don't wait for a river." Marcus spoke to Elijah for the first time in 14 months on a Thursday evening in November, on a phone Roy had helped him set up, sitting on the concrete ledge by the drainage culvert where he sat most clear mornings. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Elijah was 13 and formal in the way that 13-year-olds are formal when they have been hurt and are not certain yet whether to show it. Marcus did not try to explain everything at once. He said he was working on coming back, and that he was sorry for the time it had taken, and that he wanted Elijah to know that the time had not been about Elijah. His son was quiet for a moment. Then, he said he knew that. He said his mom had told him that. He said he was glad Marcus called. Marcus said he would call again next week. Elijah said okay. He sat on the ledge after the call for a while. The water moved the way it always moved, without comment, without memory, without any interest in what had happened on its banks, or what might happen next. He watched it the way he'd watched it on 100 mornings, and the thing he felt was not resolution. Resolution was too clean a word for something that was still in progress, still slow, still built one phone call and one morning at a time. But he was building it. That was the thing. After 3 years of the threshold moving in one direction, it had changed course. Not dramatically. Not all at once. One concrete ledge, one breakfast sandwich, one Tuesday morning when something was required, and he had simply done it and walked away, and then slowly, much later, allowed the doing of it to be the beginning of something, rather than just the end. He was 51 years old. He had a son who said okay, and meant he'd be listening next week. He had a caseworker who sat on concrete with him and told him the truth. He had the water in the morning and the city filtering in from above, and the particular knowledge of someone who has been down far enough to understand that the way back is not a single act of will, but the accumulation of days in which you choose, again and again, to remain. He had gone into the river for a girl in a pink jacket and had not told anyone his name. He had not needed anyone to know his name. He knew it. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough to stand on.